They had no idea whether the reading public of England was ready to give up the neoclassical style of poetry and move on to a completely new one. And that is why they called these poems experiments. The language, they said, was the language of conversation of common people. A lot has been written about Wordsworth's everyday language of everyday men. Can there be an everyday language of everyday men? Who is the everyday man, etc., etc.? Those of you who are doing romantic literary criticism might have come across this major discussion on what constitutes poetic diction to Wordsworth and to Coleridge. Did they differ? Did they agree? You might have heard of such things. But to come back to what we are talking about, and that is the lyrical ballads. The three editions of the lyrical ballads coming up in quick succession, 1798, 1800 and 1802. Look at your slide, my dear students. I want to talk about why this text was written. Why were the lyrical ballads published? The writers themselves say that there are two cardinal main principal points of poetry. Number one is exciting sympathy of the reader. Number two, power of giving novelty by imagination. Let's look at the first one, exciting sympathy of the reader. What does that mean? When you read a poem, do you feel, do you experience what the poet has done? And how is the poet able to do this? Because with his ability for imagination, the romantic poets, with their ability for imagination, what did they do? They gave you something new, something which you had not experienced, to make something different, to make something unusual, to make something individual. This is what the romantic poets succeeded in doing. I've been saying again and again, and most of you already do know, that the lyrical ballads was a combined effort of two poets, Wordsworth and Coleridge. They were very clear that there should be a clear division of themes, and therefore Wordsworth said that he would add the charm of novelty to things of every day. What does that mean? The themes would be from everyday life. The themes would be from everyday life. But then if it's very common, then why are you going to be interested? How are they going to succeed in exciting the sympathy of the reader? So he will have to add some charm. And one must admit that Wordsworth succeeded tremendously in doing this. Whether he's singing of the cuckoo or of the daffodils, whether he's talking about his visit to Tintern Abbey, wherever you see, in every poem of his, he succeeds in giving the charm of novelty to things of every day. So Wordsworth has decided what he wants to do. And Coleridge too has his own opinion on what he would like to do in the poems of the lyrical ballads. Look at your slide again, my dear students. Samuel Taylor Coleridge, I've used WW for William Wordsworth, and Samuel Taylor Coleridge, STC, he said he would write about persons and characters supernatural, which would lead to a willing suspension of disbelief. My dear students, do you remember when Coleridge was talking about the effect that drama had on us, when he was talking about why one goes to see a play, when he was telling us how best to appreciate a play, he used this wonderful, beautiful, imaginative phrase, willing suspension of disbelief. Here, in the poems, when he talks about the supernatural, he wants the reader to have a willing suspension of disbelief, as it is a very important phrase in Coleridge's criticism, as well as essential for us to appreciate his poems. Let me take a moment to explain what is meant by willing suspension of disbelief. When you go to see a play, when you go to see a movie, when you read a novel, you disbelieve. That means you say, oh, this can't be true. It's happening all the time in the movies that we see. Whether they are blockbusters or whether they are art movies, very often we say, but it doesn't happen like this in life. So we disbelieve. Coleridge agrees that when you go to watch a play, you must disbelieve. But how does this disbelief come? He says it should be a willing suspension. What does that mean? I know it is not true, but I cannot keep saying again and again, I know it is not true. So, my disbelief is suspended. It is suspended, right? Not totally given away. So, for some time, mofuk rakhvu, if you want in Gujarati, for some time you suspend it, but you do it willingly. That means you do not believe what you see, but you stop disbelieving what you see. I think it's a beautiful phrase which one should be able to understand if one wants to appreciate all the plays, all the movies that we see around us. So this willing suspension of disbelief is essential also for our appreciation of Coleridge's poetry. Because what did Coleridge want to do? He wanted to write about the supernatural. I just read to you a few lines from Kubla Khan, and before that a few more lines from Christabel, and you would realize that all that deals with the supernatural. He says that he would deal with persons and characters of the supernatural. Let's look at the slide again, my dear students. The first edition of the Lyrical Ballads. This is 1798. There were 19 poems by William Wordsworth and only 4 poems by Samuel Taylor Coleridge. It was a joint effort. It was a cooperative effort. But yet, my dear students, since Wordsworth had already written quite some poetry before that, since Wordsworth was already known as a poet, it was decided that there would be more poems by Wordsworth. And therefore, there were 19 poems by Wordsworth and only 4 by Samuel Taylor Coleridge. The second edition, there were some added by Wordsworth and none added by Samuel Taylor Coleridge. So the 4 remains, but Wordsworth added 4 more. And in the third edition, remember I talked about the preface and I talked about the enlarged preface. In addition to that, there was an appendix on poetic diction. An appendix on poetic diction, because I've already told you the everyday language of everyday men. So when you have everyday language of everyday men, then obviously there should be some description of what is meant by poetic diction. My dear students, I want you to think of these 2 words, poetic diction, before I come on to the next slide, which is the important poems in the Lyrical Ballads. I want to talk about poetic diction for a moment with you, because diction, you know the word dictionary, and therefore you know that the word diction means language. Is the language of poetry different from the language used by everyday, in everyday conversation, used by common people, used for different occasions? Let not the slide distract you at the moment. I'll talk to you about the poems a little later. But before that, I want you to understand what is meant by poetic diction. Wordsworth added an entire appendix on this because he and Coleridge were not very much in agreement about what constituted poetic diction. They differed, and therefore Wordsworth added his own points on what constitutes poetic diction. When we look at the important poems, that were written in the Lyrical Ballads, Tintern Abbey is a poem that you're all familiar with, a poem that you know, that you've heard about, which was by Wordsworth. When he comes back and when he sees what nature has done, how nature is different, how his attitude to nature has become different now that he is older, this is what one sees in Tintern Abbey. In Rime of the Ancient Mariner, very interestingly, you have this old person who wants to tell his story. He wants to tell the story to someone because he feels that his true penance will come only when he is able to tell this story. And so the poem begins about how he gets hold of a wedding guest, how he does not let him go, and how he wants to tell him the whole story. Rhyme is a song, mariner is a sailor, and he's an ancient mariner because it is an old mariner, an old sailor who is telling you the story. You have Simon Lee, you have the nightingale, you have expostulation and reply, and you have the tables turned. I'm sure some of you, my dear students, would love such poems like The Tables Turned, because this is what most of us would love to do but are not able to do. And what does Wordsworth advise us to do? Let me read the poem to you a little so that you appreciate what Wordsworth is telling us here. Up, up, my friend, and quit your books, or surely you'll grow double. Up, up, my friend, and clear your looks. Why all this trouble? The sun above the mountain's head, a freshening lustre mellow, through all the long green fields has spread his first sweet evening yellow. Books, such dull and endless strife, come, hear the woodland linnet. How sweet his music on my life, there's more wisdom in it. My dear students, you'd love this if you can quit your books and go out into the world of nature. But remember, what you're being invited here is to appreciate nature. What kind of nature? Nature which appeals to all the senses. Remember, all our experiences, even our intellectual experiences, reach us through our senses. Because if you're hearing my lecture, it is because your ears are working. If you're watching me deliver the lecture, it's because your eyes are working. So the senses are very important to the Romantic poets. Keats, of course, was the most sensuous of the poets, but Wordsworth too was no less. So he says, quit your books. What's the great philosophy in books? This is what Wordsworth saying, my dear friends, not me. And he says, how sweet is music on my life, there's more of wisdom in it than you can find in the books. Let nature be your teacher. This is what Wordsworth says in this beautiful poem called The Tables Turned. In fact, it's quite a favorite in many school textbooks also. So he says, let nature be your teacher. She has a world of ready wealth, our minds and hearts to bless. Spontaneous wisdom breathed by health, truth breathed by cheerfulness. And then one of my favorite verses, one impulse from a vernal wood may teach you more of man, of moral evil and of good than all the sages can. One impulse from a wood in springtime may teach you more of man, of moral evil and of good than all the sages can. Enough of science and of art. Close up those barren leaves, the leaves of the book. Close up those barren leaves. Come forth and bring with you a heart that watches and receives. My dear students, if you want to appreciate the world of nature, you must have a heart that watches and receives. It is with such poems that the lyrical ballads were first published. It is with these poems and with poems like these that the lyrical ballads continues to be an important work of literature even today, 200 years later. Let's go back to the list that we were talking about and see on your screen that you have The Tables Turned. And then we've got We Are Seven and Lines Written in Early Spring. All these poems are important. Important because they tell us what the lyrical ballads are really about. I want to talk about one or two poems which are very, very different. And here is one poem, Complaint of a Forsaken Indian Woman. I hope you're able to read, my dear students, the description of this forsaken Indian woman. I want you to remember that the Indian woman that we are talking about here is not India as our country, but we are talking about a red Indian woman, right? So the forsaken Indian woman here is the forsaken red Indian woman. The poem looks at the condition of this ordinary woman. I've taken this as an example, my dear students, to show you how Wordsworth writes different kinds of poems. Let us not imagine that all his poems deal only with the beauty of nature. I just read to you a poem called The Tables Turned, where he tells us that nature can teach us much more than books and sages can. That is one kind of poetry. There's another kind of poetry which he describes in, say, the Daffodils, My Heart Leaps Up, or in the Lucy poems, or in the Tintern Abbey, or in the Prelude, where he talks about the different effects that nature has had on him, where he talks about how he came to nature with different approaches. He says that he was like the deer which was bounding. But then, towards the end of his life, the same Wordsworth, towards the end of the great poems that he wrote, Wordsworth could say that it was the guardian, the living spirit, the guide and guardian of his life. To Wordsworth, nature had a pantheistic quality. Nature was almost like God to him. He was a worshipper of nature. And when I use the word worshipper, I don't mean that he was worshipping nature in the form of idols, but he worshipped nature all around him. He worshipped the spirit of nature. He worshipped the beauty of nature. But when I talk about, again and again, of Wordsworth as a nature poet, I want you to also remember that he was a great student of the human mind. I use the word student as somebody who is interested in learning, not a student in terms of someone who is in a school or college to get a degree. So when I talk about Wordsworth as being a student of human experience, I want to give you a poem like Lines, Complaint of a Forsaken Indian Woman. I want you to look at the poem on your screen, my dear students.